Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The Midnight Visitor. It was a bleak November evening when a most peculiar case first presented itself to Sherlock Holmes. The fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows upon the walls as Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in contemplation. I, on the other hand, had just set aside my medical journal, when a sudden frantic knocking at our door shattered the quiet. Mrs. Hudson's hurried steps could be heard in the corridor, followed by a brief murmur of conversation. A moment later she appeared, her expression taut with concern. "A gentleman has arrived in some distress, Mr. Holmes. He insists that he must see you at once." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was of middle age, dressed in a heavy overcoat, his collar turned up against the evening chill. His face was pale, his moustache quivered, and his gloved hands gripped the brim of his hat as though he feared it might vanish. He took a step forward, his breath unsteady. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice hoarse. "My name is Edwin Havisham. I have come regarding a most baffling occurrence at St. Mark's Church in Westminster. A crime, perhaps, yet one that defies logic." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Calm yourself, Mr. Havisham. A baffling occurrence, you say? Pray, be precise." Havisham exhaled sharply. "Last night at precisely midnight, a terrible cry was heard echoing through the church. The verger, who was preparing to lock up, rushed to investigate, only to find the body of the bell-ringer, Mr. Oswald Mason, sprawled lifeless upon the cold stone floor. And yet—" He hesitated. "The great bell, the one he rings every night before closing, remained silent." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers tightening slightly. "A death, but no tolling of the bell? Curious indeed. Was there any sign of violence?" Havisham shook his head. "None, sir. No wounds, no struggle." His face bore an expression of pure terror, but no hand had touched him. The doors were locked from the inside, and not a soul was seen entering or leaving the church at that hour. I glanced at Holmes. His grey eyes shone with that unmistakable glint of excitement. An enigma worthy of his talents had presented itself. "Tell me, Mr. Havisham," he said, "what reason had Mr. Mason to fear? Was there any indication that he had been threatened?" Havisham swallowed. "Not that we know of. He was a quiet man, well liked by the clergy, but—" He hesitated. "There is an old legend, Mr. Holmes, a story that some believe. They call it the Curse of the Silent Bell." Holmes let out a soft chuckle. "Ah, a touch of the supernatural. How delightful! Tell me everything, Mr. Havisham. The game is afoot." The legend of the silent bell. Mr. Edwin Havisham sat forward in his chair, his fingers gripping the armrests as though steadying himself against the very tale he was about to recount. The gaslight flickered, casting elongated shadows along the walls of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, his sharp gaze never wavering, studied the man with the keen interest of a predator observing its prey. "The Curse of the Silent Bell," Havisham murmured. It is an old tale, whispered among the congregation of St. Mark's for decades, though few take it seriously. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And yet you mention it now, Mr. Havisham. I presume that either you believe there is some truth to it, or that others do so fervently enough to warrant concern. Either way, I would hear it." Havisham nodded. "The legend speaks of a tragedy that occurred more than 50 years ago. The church bell was cast by a renowned foundryman, one Henry Etheridge, whose craftsmanship was unparalleled. He poured his life into the creation of that bell, forging it with such precision that it was said to produce the purest chime in all of London. But before it could be installed, Etheridge was found dead in the bell tower, just as Mason was last night, his face frozen in horror, his body untouched. I could not help but shudder. "And the bell?" I prompted. "It was installed nonetheless," Havisham said. "But from that day forth, strange happenings were reported. On certain nights, when the verger would ring the midnight chime, the bell would remain silent, though the rope was pulled with force, and those who witnessed it claimed that a shadow lingered in the tower, watching from above. Some said it was the spirit of Etheridge, exacting his revenge." Holmes exhaled softly, his expression unreadable. "Superstition is a powerful thing, Mr. Havisham, but I am more interested in facts. Tell me, when Mr. Mason was found, was there any sign that he had attempted to ring the bell before his death?" Havisham hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "The bell rope was clenched in his fingers, as though he had been pulling it at the moment of his demise. And yet it did not sound." I could feel a chill creeping through my spine at the eerie implications. Holmes, however, merely nodded. "A fascinating tale indeed," he mused. "And what of the church itself? Who was present that evening?" "Only the verger, Mr. Bartholomew Finch, who discovered the body. He insists that no one entered or left the church before he locked the doors. The clergyman, Reverend Alistair Vaughan, had retired to his quarters hours earlier. No one else was there." Holmes drummed his fingers against the arm of his chair. "A locked church. A man dead with no apparent cause. A bell that refuses to chime. Most intriguing." Havisham leaned forward. "You will take the case, then?" Holmes stood abruptly, reaching for his coat. "Dr. Watson and I shall accompany you to St. Mark's at once. There is much to be observed before the trail goes cold. Come, Watson, the night air shall do us good." As I rose to follow, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking into something far more sinister than mere superstition. The shadows of St. Mark's. The journey to St. Mark's was a quiet one, the carriage wheels rattling over the cobbled streets as the November mist curled through the gaslit alleys of Westminster. Havisham sat across from us, his fingers nervously twisting his hat, while Holmes remained deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the swirling fog beyond the window. "You seem troubled, Watson," Holmes remarked without shifting his gaze. "Troubled?" I echoed. "Holmes, we are about to enter a church where two men have perished under identical circumstances 50 years apart. A church that by all accounts was locked from within at the time of Mason's death. And you do not find that troubling?" Holmes's lips curled in a faint smile. "On the contrary, I find it exhilarating. A puzzle where reason and superstition collide. What greater challenge could a man ask for?" I sighed, knowing that his enthusiasm would not wane. "And do you have any theories as yet?" "Several," he admitted. "But theories are the playthings of the idle mind, Watson. Observation is our true ally. First, we must examine the scene." The carriage drew to a halt before the towering silhouette of St. Mark's. The church loomed against the night sky, its Gothic spires vanishing into the fog above. A lone gas lamp flickered near the iron gates, casting a wan glow over the stone steps. Havisham led the way, pushing open the heavy wooden doors with some effort. The interior was vast and dimly lit, the scent of old parchment and candle wax thick in the air. The vaulted ceiling arched high above us, vanishing into darkness, while rows of pews stood in solemn silence. Reverend Alistair Vaughan and Bartholomew Finch, the verger, awaited us near the chancel. The clergyman was a tall, gaunt man with thinning hair, his black robes flowing about him like the wings of a crow. Finch, by contrast, was short and stout, his round face pale with lingering unease. "You have arrived," Vaughan said solemnly, his voice echoing faintly through the chamber. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I thank you for coming." Holmes inclined his head. "Time is of the essence, Reverend. If you would be so kind as to lead us to the place where Mr. Mason was found." Vaughan gestured toward a side passage. "This way." We followed him through the dim corridor, our footsteps muffled by the ancient stone. The bell tower stood at the far end, its arched entrance framed by heavy oak beams. As we stepped inside, I felt a distinct chill settle over me. The great bell loomed high above, its iron frame disappearing into the shadows of the rafters. The long rope hung motionless, its frayed end trailing along the stone floor. Holmes moved with swift precision, his keen eyes darting across the scene. He crouched beside a faint outline on the floor, where Mason's body had been found. A candle flickered in his hand as he examined the bell rope, his fingers grazing its coarse fibres. "No sign of struggle," he murmured. "And yet Mr. Mason was clutching this rope when he fell. Tell me, Mr. Finch, was the bell ever examined after the incident?" The verger shook his head. "No one dared touch it, sir. We feared what might happen." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, fear, the great paralyzer of reason." He straightened and turned to Vaughan. "You knew Mr. Mason well?" "As well as any man can know another," the Reverend replied. "He was dutiful, faithful, and bore no enemies." Holmes nodded, then suddenly tilted his head upward. His sharp gaze lingered on the wooden beams above. "Curious," he mused. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it, Holmes?" Instead of answering, he turned to Finch. "Is there another way into this tower besides the door we entered?" The verger hesitated. "Only the small maintenance hatch in the upper chamber, but it has been locked for years. No one goes up there." Holmes smiled. "Then it would seem we have our first contradiction." His words sent a chill through the air. Something was indeed amiss in the bell tower of St. Mark's, and Holmes had already begun to unravel its mystery. The first clue. A hush fell over the bell tower as Holmes's remark lingered in the air. The contradiction he spoke of was not yet clear to me, nor, I suspected, to our companions, yet his eyes gleamed with that unmistakable sharpness. the look of a man who had already glimpsed the shape of the puzzle. Reverend Vaughan cleared his throat. "Contradiction, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned from the bell rope, dusting his hands against his coat. "Indeed, Reverend. We have before us a man who by all accounts fell dead of no apparent cause, his hands upon a bell rope that should have rung, and yet the great bell remained silent." He gestured upward. "And now we hear that the only other entrance to the tower has been locked for years. A perfect impossibility, would you not agree?" Verger Finch hesitated. Perhaps Mason simply collapsed before he could pull with enough force. Holmes smiled. "A logical assumption, but an incorrect one. You see, Mr. Finch, I examined the rope just now. There are signs of tension, faint but unmistakable. Mason did indeed pull it before he fell. The bell should have tolled." A cold draught seemed to slither through the chamber, though whether it was from the night air or the weight of Holmes's revelation, I could not say. Holmes turned suddenly. "Watson, your light, if you please." I stepped forward, holding my lantern aloft as Holmes moved toward the base of the great bell. He ran his fingers along the floor, then studied them under the flickering glow. "Dust," he murmured, "undisturbed, but here, His hand reached beneath the bell's wooden frame, and withdrew a small twisted fragment of metal. He examined it closely before slipping it into his pocket. "Curious," he said, more to himself than to us. Finch shifted uneasily. "What is it, Mr. Holmes?" "A fragment of something that does not belong," Holmes replied. "A small but telling detail." Vaughan frowned. "Do you mean to say Mason's death was no accident?" Holmes gave him a pointed look. "Reverend, men do not die of fright without a cause, and if a man reaches for a bell and the bell refuses to sound, then either the bell is faulty, or someone has ensured its silence." A palpable tension filled the tower. "Come, Watson," Holmes said suddenly. "We must inspect the upper chamber. Mr. Finch, would you be so kind as to fetch the key?" Finch hesitated. "Sir, as I said, that hatch has not been opened in years." Holmes smiled. "All the more reason to see what lies beyond." Reluctantly, the verger disappeared down the passage. I turned to Holmes. "What do you expect to find?" "Answers, my dear Watson," he murmured, "and perhaps a ghost who does not wish to be found." As Finch returned, key in hand, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far darker than a simple mystery. The hidden chamber. The verger's hands trembled slightly as he extended the rusted key to Holmes. "I warn you, sir," Finch murmured, "the chamber has been sealed for as long as I can remember. None of us have ever set foot inside." Holmes accepted the key with an air of indifference. "All the better," he remarked. "A place long undisturbed is often the most revealing." He turned to the narrow spiral staircase at the rear of the tower. The flickering lantern light cast shifting shadows along the aged stone walls as we ascended, the chill deepening with each step. The air grew heavy with dust, the scent of damp wood and cold iron thickening, as we reached a small landing where an iron hatch was set into the wall. Holmes tested the handle, but the metal barely budged. He inserted the key, twisting it with a measured force. A groan of long unused hinges echoed through the tower as the hatch creaked open, revealing a dark void beyond. Holmes stepped inside, without hesitation, and I followed, my lantern's glow illuminating the chamber beyond. It was a cramped space, no more than 6 feet wide, its wooden beams blackened with age. A single dust-covered window overlooked the churchyard below. At first glance, the room appeared empty, until Holmes crouched beside a pile of discarded cloth near the wall. With a swift motion, he lifted the fabric, revealing a small wooden crate. Its surface was scarred and splintered, as if it had been pried open with force. Holmes studied it for a moment before reaching inside. He withdrew a length of thin, coiled wire. "Fascinating," he murmured. I stepped closer. "What is it, Holmes?" "A mechanism, Watson," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet triumph. "Or rather, the remnants of one. Someone has tampered with the bell's workings." He rose and examined the rafters above. "And there, do you see it?" I followed his gaze and spotted what he meant. A faint glint of metal, half hidden behind one of the beams. Holmes climbed onto the crate, reaching up to retrieve the object. He held it up for us to see. A broken clasp, snapped at one end. The bell was not silent by accident, he declared. It was deliberately silenced. This wire, when properly secured, could have held the bell's clapper in place, preventing it from sounding when the rope was pulled. Vaughan inhaled sharply. Then Mason's death was no mere coincidence, Holmes finished. Someone ensured that when he rang for salvation, none would come. A silence settled over us, thick with unspoken thoughts. The implications were clear. This was no supernatural curse. It was murder. And whoever had silenced the bell had done so with precise intent. Holmes dusted off his coat. "Now, gentlemen, the question remains, who would go to such lengths to keep St. Mark's bell from ringing?" His eyes gleamed as he glanced toward the hatchway. And what, pray, were they so desperate to conceal? As we descended once more into the depths of the church, I felt an eerie certainty settle over me. The answer to Holmes's question lay within St. Mark's walls, and the true danger had only just begun. Whispers in the dark. The descent from the tower was marked by silence. The air inside St. Mark's seemed heavier now, as if the revelation of the tampered bell had disturbed something unseen. Holmes led the way, his movements brisk and precise, while Reverend Vaughan and Finch trailed behind, their faces drawn with apprehension. Once we reached the nave, Holmes turned sharply to face them. "Mr. Finch, you say this chamber has not been opened in years?" The verger nodded hurriedly. "No one has had cause to enter, sir. The key has been in the vestry for as long as I can recall." "Curious," Holmes mused, his fingers drumming lightly against his coat. "And yet the wire and clasp we discovered show signs of recent use. Someone has been inside that chamber, and recently at that." Vaughan's brow furrowed. "But how, Mr. Holmes? Finch and I are the only ones with access to the vestry." Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "Then either one of you is lying, or the answer lies elsewhere." Finch stiffened at the implication, his ruddy complexion paling under the gaslight. "I swear, sir, I have done no such thing." Holmes raised a hand. "Calm yourself, Mr. Finch. I merely note the facts as they stand. However, there is another angle we must consider Who would have benefited from Mason's silence? Reverend Vaughan exhaled slowly. Mason was a simple man, Mr. Holmes, a devoted caretaker. If he had enemies, I knew nothing of them. Then let us examine what he may have known, Holmes said. Tell me, was Mason behaving differently before his death? Did he mention any disturbances, any suspicions? Finch hesitated, exchanging a glance with Vaughan before answering. Now that you mention it, Mason had been unsettled of late. He spoke of noises at odd hours, footsteps where there should be none, doors left ajar when he was certain they had been locked. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did he confide in anyone, seek advice? Not to my knowledge, the verger admitted, though the day before his death he did spend some time in the church archives. Holmes's expression shifted. The archives? Aye, sir. We keep records of the church's history there. Ledgers, burial registries, land deeds, that sort of thing. Interesting, Holmes murmured. And do you know what, precisely, Mason was looking for? Finch shook his head. He never said, but I remember he seemed troubled after he left. Holmes turned on his heel. Then our next course of action is clear, Watson. We must examine the archives. Vaughan hesitated. Now? At this hour? Holmes smiled thinly. Crime does not wait for the convenience of daylight, Reverend. If Mason unearthed something worth killing for, then we must unearth it as well, before the killer strikes again. The church fell into silence. Outside, the city lay shrouded in mist, the gaslights flickering like distant stars. And within, the sacred halls of St. Mark's, the echoes of an unseen crime whispered through the dark. The secrets beneath the parchment. The church archives lay in a small dimly lit chamber, adjacent to the vestry. Rows of aged wooden shelves loomed around us, their surfaces laden with dust and time-worn tomes. The air smelled of parchment and candle wax, mingled with the faint mustiness of forgotten history. Reverend Vaughan produced a brass key and unlocked the heavy oak door. This is where Mason spent the better part of an hour before his death, he murmured. I do not know what he sought, but if it led to his murder, it must be something of great consequence. Holmes strode inside without hesitation, his keen eyes sweeping over the shelves. Watson, the lantern, if you please. I lifted my lantern, higher, casting flickering light upon the dust-covered volumes. Holmes examined the nearest shelf, running his fingers along the spines of the books. His touch was light but purposeful, as though he could sense the weight of hidden knowledge within their pages. Mr. Finch, do you recall whether Mason removed anything from here? Holmes asked without looking up. The verger hesitated. I believe he had a small bundle of papers when he left, but I did not see them closely. Holmes nodded. Then we must determine what he was after. He moved toward a large wooden desk in the centre of the room. The surface was littered with parchment, ink bottles, and a lone quill resting in a dried well of ink. But what drew Holmes's attention was the thin layer of dust disturbed in an otherwise undisturbed space. He traced the outlines of where something had recently been moved. Watson, observe, he said. A book or stack of papers once lay here, removed and in haste. See the uneven marks in the dust? A hand gripped them and lifted them quickly. I stepped closer. Then whatever Mason found, he took with him? Precisely, Holmes replied. But the question remains, what did he find? He turned back to the shelves, his fingers tapping lightly along the bindings, before stopping at a thick leather-bound volume titled The History of St. Mark's Parish. With a swift motion, he pulled it free and flipped through the pages, his eyes darting over the text with methodical precision. Suddenly, he stopped, his brow furrowed. "Ah," he murmured, "now we are getting somewhere." I peered over his shoulder, but the faded ink was difficult to decipher. "What is it, Holmes?" He held up the book, tapping a passage halfway down the page. "Read this, Watson. A record from nearly 70 years ago. In the matter of the disputed ownership of St. Mark's land, the matter is settled thus. And then, look, the ink is smudged. Deliberately, I would wager. Someone wished to obscure the details." Vaughan frowned. "A dispute? I was never aware of such a matter." "Nor, I suspect, was Mason, until very recently," Holmes said. He snapped the book shut and turned to us with a knowing glint in his eyes. "Gentlemen, I believe we have stumbled upon a secret long buried beneath the weight of time." A sudden creak echoed through the chamber. We all turned, and for a brief moment the flickering lantern light cast a shadow near the entrance. A figure, silent and still, watching from the darkness. But the moment I stepped forward, the shadow was gone. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It seems, Watson, that we are not the only ones searching for the truth." The vanishing shadow. I sprang toward the doorway, but by the time I reached it, the corridor beyond was empty. Only the distant flicker of gaslight hinted at movement in the far end of the church. I turned back to Holmes. "Did you see them?" I asked breathlessly. Holmes was already retrieving his magnifying glass, lowering it to the dusty floor near the entrance. "Not clearly, Watson, but I dare say our visitor was in rather a hurry. See here, the faint indentation of a boot leading away from the door. The dust has been disturbed in a narrow arc, which suggests a long coat swaying as they turned abruptly. Our guest is fleet-footed and cautious." Vaughan and Finch exchanged uneasy glances. The church had grown eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant creak of settling wood. But who would be skulking about the archives at this hour? The Reverend asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes dusted off his hands and stood. "That is the very question I intend to answer, Reverend. But before we rush into the darkness, we must first secure what knowledge we have gained." He strode back to the desk and reopened The History of St. Mark's Parish, flipping carefully through its aging pages. His fingers danced over the text, pausing occasionally before continuing, with a satisfied hum. "Watson, let us summarize," he said briskly. "We have an old land dispute, deliberately obscured. We have Mason, who stumbled upon something in these archives and was silenced before he could act on it. And now we have an unknown presence lurking in the shadows. The threads are converging, my dear fellow." Finch swallowed audibly. "But what does it all mean, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes tapped the book. "It means, Mr. Finch, that someone has a vested interest in keeping certain truths buried. And that interest is strong enough to kill for." A gust of wind rattled the church's stained glass windows, a distant bell from another parish tolling the hour. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. "We must find out what Mason uncovered," I said. "Surely his possessions were searched after his death." "That is precisely where we must look next," Holmes replied. "Mason's quarters may yet yield something his murderer overlooked." Vaughan hesitated. His room has remained untouched since his passing, out of respect. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Then let us hope that respect has kept our answers intact." Without another word, he turned and strode from the archives, the flickering lantern in my hand casting long shadows against the stone walls as we followed. As we made our way toward the caretaker's quarters, I could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes still watched from the darkness. The caretaker's secret. The corridor leading to Mason's quarters was shrouded in an unnatural stillness, the kind that settles over places left undisturbed for too long. The wooden floor creaked beneath our steps as we advanced, the flickering lantern casting elongated shadows against the cold stone walls. Reverend Vaughan hesitated before the door. "Mason was a man of simple habits," he murmured. "I do not know what you expect to find." Holmes merely gave a small smile. If Mason indeed stumbled upon something worth his life, then we shall expect to find precisely what his murderer sought to conceal. With that, he pushed open the door. The room was modest, neat but sparsely furnished. A narrow cot with a woolen blanket, a small wooden table with a candlestick and a Bible, and a battered chest at the foot of the bed. The air held the faint scent of oil and dust, as if time itself had grown stagnant here. Holmes moved without hesitation, his keen eyes scanning the room before settling on the chest. He crouched before it, running his fingers over the worn brass latch. "Locked," he muttered. "Watson, if you would be so kind." Anticipating his request, I produced my pocket-knife and handed it to him. With a swift motion, Holmes wedged the blade beneath the latch and twisted. A faint click broke the silence, and the lid creaked open. Inside lay a stack of folded garments, a bundle of letters tied with twine, and, at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. Holmes lifted it carefully, his gloved fingers brushing over the worn cover. "This, I suspect, will tell us what Mason knew." He flipped open the journal and began scanning the pages, his brows furrowing with growing intensity. "Ah, now, here is something of interest." I peered over his shoulder. The handwriting was small but precise. The ink faded in places. Holmes read aloud. "Strange happenings in the church of late. Found vestry door open when I swore I locked it. Footsteps in the night, though none should be there. Someone has been inside the archives, but I can find nothing missing. I feel as though I am watched. Finch tells me it is merely my imagination, but I know better. Something is amiss in St. Mark's." Holmes turned a page. And now the last entry, written the night before his death. "Tonight I finally discovered the truth. The ledger confirms it, buried beneath layers of dust and time. I must speak with the Reverend at once. If anything happens to me, let it be known. The answer lies with—" Holmes's voice stopped abruptly. I leaned closer. "What? What does it say?" He turned the book toward me. The final words were smudged, as though Mason's pen had been dragged across the page mid-sentence. The ink trailed into an illegible smear. "Blast!" I muttered. He was interrupted. Holmes snapped the book shut, or silenced before he could write the name. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finch shifted uncomfortably. his face pale. Then he was murdered over something in the archives. Undoubtedly, Holmes said, and we are now closer than ever to uncovering why. Before he could say more, a sound echoed from the corridor outside, a soft but unmistakable creak of floorboards. We were not alone. Holmes's eyes flickered toward the door. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Gentlemen, I suggest you brace yourselves. Our shadow in the dark has returned." A figure in the dark. The creaking floorboard sent a chill through the room, as if the very walls had exhaled in warning. Holmes's sharp gaze flickered toward the doorway, and with a swift motion he doused the lantern's flame, plunging us into darkness. "Not a sound," he whispered. We stood motionless, ears straining against the silence. The unmistakable sensation of being watched gripped me, tightening around my chest. Then, another creak, closer this time. Holmes moved like a shadow, slipping toward the door. My hand instinctively went to my revolver, though I dared not draw it just yet. A long pause followed, and then, as if emboldened by the absence of light, the figure stepped forward. In a sudden flash, Holmes threw the door open, and the dim corridor light revealed a cloaked figure just beyond the threshold. With startling agility, the intruder spun on their heel and bolted down the hallway. "After him, Watson!" Holmes cried, already in pursuit. We lunged into the corridor, our footsteps pounding against the wooden floor. The shadowy figure darted toward the nave, their cloak billowing behind them. As we reached the church's main hall, the fleeing form twisted around a pillar and veered toward a side door. Holmes was quicker. With an astonishing burst of speed, he reached the door just as the figure wrenched it open. Holmes lunged, grasping the intruder's shoulder, and with a swift motion yanked them back into the dim candlelight. A sharp gasp escaped Reverend Vaughan's lips. "Good heavens!" The hood of the cloak had fallen back, revealing the pale, fearful face of Harold Finch. For a long moment the only sound was Finch's ragged breathing. His eyes darted wildly, his expression shifting between fear and defiance. Holmes, his grip firm, regarded the man with cool detachment. "Mr. Finch," he said in a voice of quiet amusement, "you have a rather unfortunate talent for appearing precisely where you should not be." Finch swallowed hard. I was only—" "Spare us the pretence," Holmes interrupted. "You were eavesdropping, I suspect. You have been for quite some time." The verger's gaze darted to the Reverend, then back to Holmes. "I didn't mean no harm," he stammered. "I swear it, I only—" Holmes released him with a look of mild contempt. "If you wish to convince me of your innocence, Mr. Finch, I suggest you begin by telling the truth. The entire truth." Finch hesitated, wringing his hands. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he spoke. "It's about the land," he confessed. "The old dispute, the one in the archives. Mason figured out something that shouldn't have come to light." "What exactly did he find?" I demanded. Finch glanced at Vaughan, then lowered his voice. "There was an agreement, long ago, before any of us were born, a secret deal between the church and a wealthy patron. But someone tampered with the records, erased the truth." Holmes's eyes glinted. "And you knew about this?" Finch's face crumpled. "Not at first," he admitted, "but after Mason started digging, I grew suspicious. I followed him that night. I saw him leave the archives with a bundle of papers. I thought nothing of it until he turned up dead." A heavy silence followed. Holmes folded his arms. "And tell me, Finch, who else knew what Mason had discovered?" The verger hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "The churchwarden." A slow smile crept onto Holmes's face. "Ah," he murmured, "now we are getting somewhere." The churchwarden's oath Holmes's expression did not waver as he studied Finch's trembling form. The verger's confession had shifted the tide of our investigation, yet a vital question remained. How deeply was the churchwarden entangled in this sinister affair? Reverend Vaughan's brow furrowed. "Mr. Cooper?" he asked in disbelief. "The churchwarden has served St. Mark's for over 30 years. If he knew anything about this buried agreement, surely he would have spoken of it." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A most charitable assumption, Reverend, though I fear reality is often less noble. We must speak with Mr. Cooper at once." Finch fidgeted. "At this hour?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "The truth does not sleep, Mr. Finch, nor do murderers." Without further delay, we made our way to the churchwarden's cottage, a modest dwelling just beyond the churchyard. A lantern burned dimly in the window, casting a flickering glow over the ivy-clad stone walls. Holmes knocked firmly on the wooden door. A moment passed before we heard the shuffling of feet. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with sharp, weathered features. His gaze flickered between us, lingering on Reverend Vaughan with a mix of surprise and concern. "Reverend, what brings you here so late?" Vaughan hesitated, but Holmes stepped forward. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Cooper, but time is of the essence. We must speak with you regarding the late Mr. Mason." At the mention of the caretaker's name, Cooper's face paled slightly. He hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, then," he muttered. The interior of the cottage was sparse, yet tidy. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a half-read newspaper lay on the table beside a cup of tea. Cooper gestured toward the chairs, but Holmes remained standing. "You were aware of Mason's research into the parish archives?" Holmes asked without preamble. Cooper's jaw tightened. "I was." "And did you attempt to dissuade him from his inquiries?" The old man exhaled sharply. "I told him to let it lie," he admitted. "Some things are best left in the past." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I see. And would you care to elaborate on what exactly was meant to remain? Buried?" Cooper's gaze flickered toward Finch, then Vaughan, as if weighing his words. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "There was an agreement long ago, before my time even. A certain benefactor provided financial support to the church in exchange for certain considerations regarding the land rights. I leaned forward, and these considerations were—" Cooper's lips pressed into a thin line. "The records were altered. The true ownership of the land upon which St. Mark stands was erased. It was meant to be a temporary arrangement, but over time the truth became inconvenient. So it was hidden." Holmes nodded. "And Mason found proof of this deception?" Cooper swallowed. "Yes. He found the original ledger, the one that should have been destroyed." A tense silence settled over the room. Reverend Vaughan shook his head in disbelief. And so someone killed Mason to keep this secret. Holmes studied the churchwarden carefully. Tell me, Mr. Cooper, when Mason confided in you, did he mention whether he had shared his discovery with anyone else? Cooper hesitated, then nodded slowly. He did. Holmes's eyes darkened. And who, pray, was the recipient of this knowledge? The old man's voice was barely a whisper. The benefactor's descendant. A chill ran down my spine. This was no longer merely a case of a stolen legacy. It was a matter of inheritance, deception, and murder. Holmes straightened, his voice firm. Mr. Cooper, I advise you to remain here. If I am correct, the true culprit may soon make their move. Cooper's eyes widened. You mean... Holmes turned to me. Come, Watson. We must act swiftly before another life is lost. With that, he strode toward the door, his coat billowing behind him like a spectre in the firelight. The final deduction. The crisp night air bit at our faces as Holmes and I strode briskly from Cooper's cottage. The revelation weighed heavily upon us. The true heir of the disputed land had learned of Mason's discovery. But who among our suspects fit that role? Holmes's keen eyes gleamed in the gaslight. We have but one move left, Watson. To corner our adversary before they slip beyond our grasp. Then you know who it is? I asked, my pulse quickening. Holmes gave a thin smile. I have known for some time. The pieces merely needed arranging. Instead of hailing a cab, he led me back toward the church. It stood solemn and silent, the looming bell tower casting long shadows. Holmes glanced at his pocket watch and nodded. They will come, he murmured. They must. We did not. Wait long. A figure emerged from the side entrance, moving swiftly toward the graveyard. The moonlight revealed a tall, cloaked silhouette. Holmes gestured for silence as we followed, our footsteps muffled against the damp earth. As the figure knelt beside a tombstone and reached into their coat, Holmes struck. Stay where you are. His voice rang out like a gunshot. The figure jerked upright, startled. In the dim glow, I recognized Reverend Vaughan. The clergyman's face, usually so composed, was taut with fear. In his hand, he clutched a bundle of old parchment, the very records Mason had uncovered. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes glinting. I must commend you, Reverend. A masterful performance. Vaughan's lips parted, but no words came. You played the devoted shepherd well, Holmes continued, his voice razor-sharp. You feigned innocence, yet you guided us, step by step, away from the truth. You killed Mason because he uncovered your secret. Vaughan's grip on the parchment tightened. I don't know what you mean. Oh, but you do, Holmes pressed. You are the last descendant of the so-called benefactor. The land beneath St. Mark's was rightfully yours, stolen through deception generations ago. When Mason uncovered the truth, you realized that if those records saw daylight, your claim would become public knowledge. And with it, scandal, investigation. The church's reputation, your reputation, would be ruined. A tremor ran through Vaughan's body. I only meant to reason with him, he whispered. But he refused to listen. He threatened to go to the authorities. I had no choice. Holmes's voice was cold. There is always a choice, Reverend. Vaughan sagged against the tombstone, Defeated, I only wanted to protect what was left of my family's legacy. Kiam Tursudi. Before another word could be spoken, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the graveyard. Lestrade and his men emerged from the darkness, summoned by Holmes earlier in anticipation of this very moment. Vaughan did not resist as the inspector took him into custody. As the clergyman was led away, I turned to Holmes. "You suspected him all along, didn't you?" Holmes exhaled slowly. The moment we stepped into the church that first night, a man of faith, yet a man burdened. His misdirection was too carefully woven. I shook my head. A tragic waste. He could have simply come forward. Holmes's gaze drifted to the towering bell above. Men kill not only for greed, Watson, but for fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of losing what little they believe they have left. We stood in silence for a moment longer before Holmes turned on his heel. "Come, my friend, the night is cold, and I find myself in desperate need of a hot cup of tea." And with that, the case of the silent bell was closed.